Nearly 200,000 people are under evacuation orders this morning. A spillway at the nation's tallest dam is in danger of failing and releasing floodwaters into towns below.
In 2020, California announced the most controversial environmental project in the state's history, removing 4 massive dams from the Klamath River in what would become the world's largest dam removal project.
You said is the largest restoration project in the history of the Trinity River.
The Siskiyou County Water Users Association called it an environmental disaster waiting to happen.
So, I mean, it's absolutely insane to take these reservoirs out.
Local farmers and ranchers warned it would destroy their way of life and devastate the regional economy. Environmental critics argued that releasing decades of toxic sediment would kill more fish than it would save. Republican politicians dismissed it as an ideological waste of $500 million in taxpayer money. For 2 decades, residents and farmers had protested the removal, organizing opposition groups and filing lawsuits to stop what they saw as ecological madness. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was taking shape. Quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. And now, 5 years later, those same critics were shocked. Because what happened next stunned marine biologists, environmental scientists, and even the project's harshest opponents. To understand how removing 4 dams transformed 420 miles of river ecosystem, we need to go back to 1918. That was the last time salmon had access to their full ancestral spawning grounds in the Klamath River watershed. For over a century, Iron Gate, Copco No. 1, Copco No. 2, and J.C. Boyle dams had blocked one of the West Coast's most important salmon runs, turning a once-thriving river system into a series of stagnant reservoirs. Welcome to Forgotten Lands, where we uncover the impossible transformations that changed everything. The Klamath River had once been the 3rd largest salmon producer on the West Coast, supporting indigenous communities for thousands of years and sustaining massive commercial fisheries. But by the early 1900s, the race to harness the river's power for electricity generation began transforming this natural highway into an industrial waterway. The 4 dams were built between 1918 and 1962, creating a series of reservoirs that fundamentally altered the river's ecology. What had been a cold, fast-flowing river became a chain of warm, stagnant lakes. The dams blocked salmon and steelhead from reaching 420 miles of pristine spawning habitat in the upper watershed, forcing these ancient fish runs to collapse. But the real ecological disaster was happening in the reservoirs themselves. Without the river's natural flow, algae blooms exploded every summer, creating toxic conditions that made the water dangerous for human contact. Heavy metals accumulated in the sediment behind the dams, lead, chromium, cadmium, and aluminum building up for over 60 years. The water became so polluted that swimming was unsafe, and the reservoirs became ecological dead zones. By the 1990s, the Klamath River was experiencing regular fish kills. Disease outbreaks wiped out tens of thousands of salmon. The once mighty river system was dying, and the dams that were supposed to bring prosperity had created an environmental catastrophe. When the Klamath River Renewal Corporation announced plans to remove all 4 dams in 2020, the backlash was immediate and fierce. The Siskiyou County Water Users Association threw its full opposition against the project, arguing that dam removal would be an economic and environmental disaster. Local farmers and ranchers, many of whom had built their livelihoods around the reservoirs, saw the project as a direct attack on their communities. They had used the reservoir water for irrigation and livestock, and the artificial lakes had become centers of recreational fishing and tourism. Rex and other Klamath River residents organized protests, warning that removing the dams would destroy property values and eliminate jobs. Environmental critics raised even more alarming concerns. William Simpson, writing extensively in the Siskiyou News, warned that decades of toxic sediment trapped behind the dams would be released downstream, poisoning the river with heavy metals. He documented high concentrations of lead, chromium, cadmium, and aluminum in the reservoir sediments, arguing that releasing these toxins would create an ecological disaster far worse than the existing problems. The opposition wasn't just local. Republican members of Congress launched what the Waterkeeper Alliance called ideological opposition to dam removal, arguing that the project represented government overreach and fiscal irresponsibility. Critics pointed to the $500 million price tag as evidence that the project was a wasteful boondoggle that would benefit no one. Even some environmental groups were skeptical. The The project seemed too ambitious, too expensive, and too risky. Many experts believed that after more than a century of ecological damage, the Klamath River system was too degraded to recover. The salmon runs had been decimated for so long that many questioned whether they could ever return. If you're fascinated by this story of environmental restoration against all odds, comment DAMS below, and let me know what you think about taking on projects that everyone says are impossible. But the science behind dam removal was more solid than critics realized. For decades, federal agencies had been studying the Klamath River system, conducting hundreds of thousands of water and sediment samples. Multiple presidential administrations, both Republican and Democratic, had reviewed the data and concluded that dam removal was not only safe, but necessary for the river's recovery. The breakthrough came when Pacificorp, the utility company that owned the dams, determined that removing them would be less expensive than upgrading them to meet current environmental standards. The aging infrastructure was becoming a liability, and the company agreed to support the removal project. In January 2024, the deconstruction began. Massive excavators started tearing down Iron Gate Dam, the largest of the four structures. The sight of heavy machinery dismantling what had seemed like permanent fixtures in the landscape was surreal for local residents who had lived with the dams their entire lives. The first major milestone came in April 2024, when crews breached 3 of the remaining dams, draining the reservoirs behind them. For the first time in over a century, the Klamath River found its historical channel, flowing freely through areas that had been underwater for generations. The immediate aftermath seemed to confirm critics' worst fears. Drone footage shot by William Simpson showed dead fish floating in the newly exposed riverbed, images that went viral on social media and fueled opposition to the project. The Klamath River Renewal Corporation had predicted some fish mortality, but the visual impact was shocking to many observers. Siskiyou County, responding to resident concerns, paid for independent water testing of the river. When the results showed elevated levels of heavy metals like aluminum, chromium, and lead, some above drinking water standards, critics felt vindicated in their opposition. Linda and Jim Leach began collecting mason jars of Klamath River water every day, documenting changes in temperature and clarity on Facebook groups that attracted thousands of followers. Jim feared that contaminated river water would somehow infiltrate nearby wells, poisoning groundwater supplies. The controversy intensified as sediment-laden water flowed downstream, creating muddy conditions that persisted for months. Critics argued that the project was proceeding exactly as they had predicted, creating an environmental disaster that would take decades to resolve. But water treatment specialist Dr. Tongren Zhu from Sacramento State offered a different perspective on the water quality data. He explained that elevated heavy metal levels were temporary and expected during the initial drawdown phase. The sediment release, while visually dramatic, was part of the river's natural process of finding its new equilibrium. More importantly, the dead fish that had caused such alarm were primarily non-native species that had lived in the artificial reservoir environment. These fish couldn't survive in the restored river conditions, but their deaths made room for native species to return. If this incredible story of environmental transformation is inspiring you, hit that like button and subscribe to Forgotten Lands for more stories of impossible projects that changed the world. By late 2024, the transformation was undeniable. NOAA Marine Habitat Resource Specialist Bob Paglucco announced that Chinook salmon and steelhead were already exploring upstream areas for the first time in over 60 years. The fish were moving faster than anyone had predicted, immediately beginning to occupy habitats that had been blocked for generations. The water quality improvements were dramatic. Brian Kluwer, a fluvial geomorphologist working on the project, explained that removing the reservoirs allowed the river water to aerate naturally, increasing oxygen levels and reducing the toxic algae production that had plagued the system for decades. The water temperature dropped significantly, creating ideal conditions for salmon survival. NOAA fish biologist Sherry Whitmore, who had spent more than 20 years working toward this moment, described watching the recovery as impressive and emotional. The speed of the river's response exceeded all scientific projections. The economic benefits were equally surprising. Rather than destroying local jobs, the dam removal project generated over 1,400 employment opportunities in construction, restoration, and environmental monitoring. The federal government allocated $18 million to the Yurok tribe for tributary restoration, and another $1.9 million to Oregon's Department of Fish and Wildlife for additional improvements. Indigenous tribal workers, led by people like Richard Green, were hired to replant native vegetation across thousands of acres of newly exposed land. The revegetation effort was not only creating jobs, but also restoring cultural connections between tribal communities and their ancestral river. Resource Environmental Solutions, the contractors managing the restoration, documented remarkable regrowth in areas that had been underwater for decades. Seeds planted in March 2024 were already sprouting by summer, and the barren mudflats were transforming into thriving riparian forests. The sediment concerns that had dominated early criticism proved to be temporary. Continuous monitoring showed that water clarity and contaminant levels improved significantly within months of the dam removals. The river was cleaning itself faster than anyone had anticipated. Barry McCovey, director of the Yurok Tribe Fisheries Department, captured the transformation perfectly. The Yurok people are extremely happy to be witnessing the beginning of the Klamath River's rebirth. The dams caused a tremendous amount of damage to the Klamath over the last century. Through the decommissioning project and holistic restoration, we are confident that we will see the Klamath salmon, steelhead, and Pacific lamprey runs recover. The project that critics had called an environmental disaster was becoming one of the most successful ecosystem restoration efforts in American history. Tommy Williams, a NOAA research fisheries biologist, predicted that fish would soon be migrating through the system 365 days a year, creating a resilience that hadn't existed for over a century. The $500 million investment that politicians had dismissed as wasteful was generating benefits far beyond its cost. The restored river system was providing flood control, carbon sequestration, and habitat for hundreds of species. Property values along the free-flowing river were actually increasing as the ecosystem recovered. Perhaps most remarkably, the project was inspiring similar efforts across the country. The success of the Klamath River dam removal was proving that even the most degraded ecosystems could be brought back to life with the right approach and sufficient commitment. The critics who had spent 2 decades fighting the project were witnessing something they had never thought possible. The toxic reservoirs were gone, replaced by a clean, free-flowing river. The dead zones had become thriving habitats. The waste of taxpayer money had become a model for environmental restoration worldwide. Today, as salmon swim freely through 420 miles of restored habitat for the first time in over a century, it's hard to imagine that anyone ever thought this river system was beyond saving. But sometimes the most important transformations happen not despite the skepticism and opposition, but because someone was willing to prove that restoration is always possible. The world's largest dam removal project didn't just restore a river, it restored hope for environmental recovery everywhere. The critics who laughed at California for taking on an impossible project are now witnessing one of the greatest conservation success stories in American history.